Have you ever looked into the mirror and wondered what the end of the world would actually look like? In October, the citizens of Messina, Sicily, didn't have to wonder anymore. They saw it in the eyes of the sailors arriving from the Black Sea, eyes that were sunken, bloodshot, and filled with a terror that no words could describe. Imagine waking up on a crisp autumn morning. You feel a slight fever, a small ache in your groin or under your arm. You reach out to touch it and your heart freezes. There it is, a hard black swelling the size of an apple. In the nth century they called these bubas. To you it is an executioner fice mark. Within hours your skin will turn black in patches as your body begins to rot from the inside while you are still breathing. This was keying just a disease. It was an invisible predator that turned your own biology against you. Before we dive into the darkness, we must understand the height from which humanity fell. The earlier Mittelmeer terms were a golden age of stability and growth. Europe was a vibrant, interconnected hive of activity. Gothic cathedrals were reaching for the heavens, and trade networks were moving silk and gold faster than ever before. But this very progress, this medieval internet of trade routes, became the highway for the apocalypse. The origin of the nightmare lay thousands of miles away in the silent, windswept steppes of Central Asia. There, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had lived for millennia in a delicate balance with marmots and squirrels. But nature shifted. A sudden climate change drove these infected rodents toward human settlements. The bacteria didn't just jump to humans, it used a tiny, ravenous intermediary, the flea. Inside the gut of a flea, the plague bacteria create a physical blockage. The flea becomes starving, unable to swallow. In its frantic desperation to feed, it bites anything that moves: humans, dogs, cats, vomiting the deadly infection directly into the host fice's bloodstream. This tiny, starving insect was the spark that set the world on fire. By the time the ships arrived in Sicily, the social fabric was already beginning to tear. We often hear about the numbers, the millions who died, but Tim wants to take you closer. Imagine the silence of a city where the church bells have stopped ringing because the bell ringers are all dead. Imagine the smell of a street where the sewers are overflowing and the only scent is the thick, cloying odor of death. This is where our journey begins. The siege of Kaffa and the birth of biological warfare. To understand how the plague breached the unbreakable walls of Europe, we must look at a horrific event in the siege of Kaffa. Kaffa was a wealthy Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, protected by massive stone walls. Surrounding them was the mighty Mongol army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. But a silent killer was already stalking the Mongol camp. Soldiers were dying by the thousands, keck from Genoese arrows, but from the black boils. Janibeg, facing a humiliating defeat, made a decision that would haunt history forever. He ordered the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers to be loaded onto catapults and hurled over the walls of Kaffa. For days, it rained dead bodies. The Genoese defenders watched in absolute horror as the rotting remains of their enemies smashed into their homes and market squares. They didn't know about germs, but they knew the smell of death carried a curse. The fluids from the corpses and the fleas abandoned their cold hosts for warm, living Genoese citizens. The fortress was breached from the inside. Panicked, the surviving Genoese merchants fled on high galleys. They thought they were escaping to safety, but they were carrying the end of the world in their cargo holds. As these ships docked at major ports like Constantinople, Messina, and Marseille, they seeded the infection at every stop. Messina was the first to fall. When the galleys arrived, dockworkers found sailors delirious with pain, covered in oozing black boils. The authorities ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was too late. The black rats, ubiquitous on medieval ships, had already scurried down the mooring ropes onto the docks. Messina became a ghost town in weeks. The terror of contagion was so great that it severed the most sacred human bonds. Fathers abandoned sons and mothers left their dying infants. This was the beginning of the Great Mortality, a period where humanity proved it was both fragile and, at times, cruel under the weight of fear. The collapse of reason and the search for scapegoats. By MNITEM, the plague had reached the dense heart of Europe, Paris, Florence, and London. These cities were tinder boxes for disease, narrow alleys, timber houses blocking the sun, and open sewers running down the center of streets. When the plague hit, it didn't just kill people, it killed the city as a functioning organism. Imagine being a doctor at the University of Paris, the greatest mind of your time, yet you are completely baffled. Without the concept of bacteria, they turned to the stars. They believed a planetary alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in had released corrupted air from the Earth. The cures were often more dangerous than the disease. Doctors advised people to bathe, fearing that opening the pores would let the poison in. They lanced the buboes, which only spread the infection into the blood faster. They burned rosemary and aromatic woods, creating a thick, fragrant fog that did nothing to stop the invisible killer. When science failed, people turned to God. But the church, the bedrock of medieval life, was failing too. Priests were dying faster than their parishioners because they were the ones administering last rites to the sick. This created a profound psychological crisis. If God was listening to the holy men, who was he listening to? A radical, desperate piety emerged, the flagellant movement. Bands of hundreds of men marched from town to town, whipping themselves with iron, tipped scourges until they bled, hoping to appease God's wrath. They were a terrifying sight, bringing religious hysteria wherever they went, but the darkness grew even deeper. If God was silent, people looked for a human devil to blame. A horrific conspiracy theory took root, that the Jewish communities were poisoning the wells of Christendom. Despite official condemnations by Pope Clement V, the mob mentality took over. Entire communities in cities like Strasbourg and Cologne were rounded up and burned alive. The Black Death had unleashed the absolute worst aspects of human nature. The silent countryside and the reclamation of nature. While the cities were the epicenters, of Europe lived in the countryside. The plague followed the river barges and peasant carts into the most remote villages. Thousands of small settlements, whose names are lost to history, were completely wiped out. The impact on rural life was slower but perhaps more profound. The manorial system, the very spine of medieval society, ground to a halt. Imagine eerie scenes described by chroniclers, ripe harvests rotting in the fields because there was one left to bring them in. Herds of sheep and cows wandering aimlessly through the landscape, eventually dying of neglect because their shepherds were all dead. As human presence faded, the wilderness began to reclaim the land. Wolves, emboldened by the lack of people, began encroaching on the remaining settlements. By Mamai, the plague had reached the frozen limits of Scotland and Scandinavia, even dealing a death blow to the Norse colonies in Greenland. By Mamai, the initial catastrophic wave finally began to burn itself out. The bacteria had simply run out of victims. The fog began to lift, revealing a continent transformed beyond recognition. Historians estimate that between Bimil and Haitu million people had died across Eurasia. In Europe alone, in the Mamai of the population had vanished in less than years. Survivors emerged into a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. The immediate aftermath was chaos and inflation, but then something truly remarkable happened, a sea twist in history that paved the way for your world today. The rebirth, how death created the modern world. You might think that losing half of humanity would result in a permanent dark age. But the Black Death actually triggered the greatest economic and social revolution in history. This is the part they didn't teach you in school. Because there were so few people left, there was a massive labor shortage. For the time in centuries, the peasant held the power. Lords were desperate to have their land worked and were forced to offer higher wages and better conditions. The rigid structures of serfdom, where you were tied to the land like property, cracked and shattered. The golden age of the laborer had begun. Diets improved as people could afford meat instead of bread. Survivors inherited the wealth of those who had died, leading to a sudden surge in capital. This newfound wealth and social mobility fueled the rise of the middle class and eventually the Renaissance. Even medicine began to change. The failure of ancient Greek theories forced doctors to actually observe the human body. Hospitals shifted from being places where you went to die to places where people tried to cure you. The psychological scars, however, ran deep. Art became obsessed with death. You've likely seen the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death. It showed skeletons dancing kings, popes, and peasants alike to the grave. It was a stark, brutal reminder that death is the ultimate equalizer. The Black Death was the greatest trauma Western civilization ever endured. It shattered the optimism of the high Middle Ages but cleared the ground for the modern world to grow. It proved that even in the face of an invisible apocalypse, humanity has an incredible capacity to adapt, rebuild, and find power in the ashes. For centuries, the Black Death was treated as a distant medieval nightmare. But empty streets, locked homes, and the fear of the air itself, does that sound like ancient history, or does it feel uncomfortably familiar? The plague was a test of civilization, and tests have a way of repeating. I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.
History is a mirror.